Witch Hunts and the Federal Reserve. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's written a fascinating article today that I'm very much looking forward to learning more about. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going very well. How are you?
I'm good. Now, I know, witch hunts, it's a fascinating topic to be discussing, particularly linking to the Federal Reserve. Let's get into it, eh?
You know what I want to do. Can I just say a quick hello to my daughter? She knows what this is about. So let's start with Thomas Sowell, who is this amazing economist in the US, which in writing this, I took the opportunity to research him, and he's amazing. Some of the stuff he's 93 years old. He came from Carolina. He grew up in Harlem in New York, left school, joined the army, went to Harvard, and then became an amazing professor of economics. He is 93 and just released a book. He's awesome. And some of these ideas that he's had over the last since about the 1960s have really started to rear their ugly heads. But as he would say, it's all in history. So this stuff that is going on at the moment has happened in history before. And it just keeps cropping up. So if anyone gets a chance, go and read about his stuff because it's very cool. But one of the things he's spoken about is basically the growth in government, the corruption in government, and how things change not for the benefit of society within government, but for the benefit of individuals, whether they be politicians or individuals. We'll talk about the Federal Reserve in a minute, like JP Morgan. So I thought I'd start with the Salem Witch Hunt. Can we do that one?
Yeah, certainly.
So that one's a really interesting one. And the reason I picked that one in time was it's probably relevant to right now that one of the key issues in it was actually migration. So in 1692 to 1693, there was a war going on. There were a whole heap of migrants that moved to an area in Essex, which was in the USA. And because of the strain on resources that was going on, people started scrambling around. There was a group of people called the Putnams who decided that they wanted to have their own municipality. They got their own minister, and then people stopped paying taxes, and then people started saying witch, and then everyone started talking about witches. The gossip, the newspapers started talking about witches, and lo and behold, 19 people were hung. But what's interesting is you dig into the details. The Putnams wanted land, so they started a municipality. Other people who were annoyed about it decided to stop taxes, which took power away from a minister. So he started saying witches. And then there was a judge who started the Council of Oyer and Terminal, who also went for power and basically started his own port. So at the end of the day, people running around calling each other witches and was for political gain, financial gain, and the whole community lost 20 people and no one was better off.
So, obviously there's a theme here of corruption behind underpinning all of that, championing of causes. If you think about the example you've just given, you've got lots of comparisons that people will make, right? I think listening to that, people will be making comparisons to a whole raft of things that are going on at the moment. When you
and
think about
not just government, this happens across everything. It happens across society, companies. It's a fantastic analogy of people applying it to organizations.
Well, and that's what I was thinking, because you could even be thinking of it in terms of gossips in your circle yourself. There's lots of areas where that would work. You then went and explored the link between that and the Federal Reserve, and I thought that was really powerful because we've talked multiple times about how the Federal Reserve has changed its approach to society, how it's, there's a role it seems to be playing in the media, where it never used to be as much. It's sort of out there the jawboning, the discussing, trying to influence public perception. Pull that together for us, because I thought that was really interesting.
So I just want to clear one thing up. It's not always corruption. It is, you might get someone who's wealthy behind the scenes encouraging a politician for power. That person might give them a statistic. So it might be, it might be the racial divide. This statistic is less African Americans are in university than Anglos. So statistic. Without investigation as to maybe the socioeconomic reasons or Sal even brings up geography as one of the key differentials. So it's not race only, there's geography, there's other things, but it is someone picking a statistic and championing it. It's feeding it to the media and saying, hey, look at this is what's going on, without actually having an understanding of all of the statistics, and without acknowledging that you can never understand all of the statistics. But picking one statistic and championing it is what allows it to go on. So ultimately, you would suggest that there is a corruption at the end, but that is not that everyone wants a financial or a power gain. Is that corruption? Not necessarily. It's just human nature. So I think that's a distinct differential. So in regard to the Federal Reserve, 1907, there was a banking crisis. I mean, we've talked about this before. There was a run on the banks, and JP Morgan, who was JP Morgan, the person, not JP Morgan, the bank at the time, organised a meeting with all his fellow bankers. One of them, if you remember, is Rothschild. So there were quite a few of these famous bankers in the mix. And in 1907, they organised a backstop. So $25 million was to be provided by these bankers, and it backstopped the run on the banks because it provided surety for the banks, which ultimately is what the Federal Reserve was meant to be set up to do. But 1907, it was fixed. We didn't have a Federal Reserve at that point in time. The Federal Reserve did not come into 1913, but it seems the idea of the Federal Reserve was then championed at that point by a senator, Nelson Aldrich, who took it on and decided, oh no, if this happens again, he chicken littled the whole thing, said, if the sky falls again, what are we going to do? We need a Federal Reserve. So he championed it, probably for his own political gain, political power. But who did he involve in setting up the Federal Reserve? The 1907 bankers that fixed it before. It was not ultimately the government that made all the decisions around the Federal Reserve. It was a meeting on Jekyll Island, held under the cover of night with duck hunters, with bankers disguised as duck hunters, that went to an island for a week and came up with the system and the enterprise, I guess, that we now have as the Federal Reserve. Now, what Sal talks about is, the Fed represented hope, but we've had so many programs that represented hope that ended in disaster. Now, we are 110 years on from the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and we have had more booms and busts than than in the history of Western civilization. The Fed was meant to be set up to backstop banks, but in the 1930s, we had more banks than ever disappear. It was the biggest deflationary period in the history, in Western civilization's history. The Federal Reserve has not done what it was set up to do. And because we have huge deflation and now we've had huge inflation, they've ultimately failed. And if you look at society now, JP Morgan's still a very big bank and they are doing very well, and society does not look better off for what the Federal Reserve was meant to be. So at the end of the day, those that benefited were the few, and those that have suffered have been society.
One bit you said it a bit earlier when you were effectively saying it's not always the intention of corruption, right? Like when you say that, and that it was such a valid point, because it isn't necessarily the intention, but this idea of of championing, we both struggle with that word today, championing those causes. The issue, I suppose, for me, with everything that you've just said there, is that because you said no one has all the information, which is true, right? No one has the whole picture. But when you're the Fed, or when you're the authorities in the Fed, even the chairman of the Fed, and you're coming across having putting out the information and pushing that cause, does some responsibility then come back on you to go, well, yeah, your intention might not be that it's corrupt, but if use the example of the 2% inflation target, right? Like that, and that's a really good example, I think, because I was listening to something just yesterday that was saying the origins of that was a Bank of New Zealand decision somewhere along the line that just said 2%, like they just made it up. It wasn't even a real thing. It wasn't backed by anything. And there's been lots of research since that's about the right number. But when you keep hearing something from someone in authority like that, pushing that cause, it gets a life of its own. It grows into something much bigger. What's your thought on that?
Okay, we're going to stop at one thing. 2% is about the right number, according to who and on what statistics? So let's just pull it back to, crap feeds crap. So who knows if 2% is the right number, but if you're specifically researching for 2% to be the right number, you're probably going to come up with 2% is correct. Yeah. So can you ask the rest of the question again?
Well, I was just thinking, linking it all together, right? Like, is that the modern day version of this, where it's is the Fed the town gossip here that's sort of saying, well, like they're not at 2%. It should be at 2%. It's and is it similar? Like, is there an analogy there between the witch trials, right? Like, is it sort of the same thing where you've got someone in that position of authority that's trying to do it maybe for their own objectives that don't really align?
So I would answer that in two ways. So the first way is yes. So, I mean, particularly among my understanding is, and this might be wrong, but I do understand that within the Reserve Bank, there are a lot more Democrats and Republicans, which just makes it beyond biased at the start. That, I think, is just something I've read as opposed to anything else. So if anyone wants to factually correct me on that, I'm okay with that. The second part of this is the Federal Reserve is no longer the problem. The RBA is no longer the problem. Things are out of control. We talk about fiscal irresponsibility. The Federal Reserve has actually just become a scapegoat for governments to spend too much money and them to pretend they can fix it. So you can come up with any number you would like right now, but the Federal Reserve, the RBA, any bank in the world right now is as useless as its government in power. And if they continue to have uncontrolled spending, and if they continue to do what they're doing, it doesn't matter if the Fed's corrupt or not. It doesn't matter if the RBA is corrupt or not, which I wholeheartedly don't think. They are powerless, and it has become a powerless institution paying taxpayers' money wages to keep up the farce of government spending. Next week, I'd like to bring up some examples of the opposition of Canada. I can't remember his name at the moment, had this great quote. I'm going to bring it up next week because it was really fun, which was basically governments need to stop trying to do everything badly and start trying to govern properly. They're spending too much money on all the wrong things. As Sal keeps pointing out, there is a proliferation of government agencies to do someone's doing, and someone within the government suddenly has a CEO job at an agency. There's just too much money being spent on useless, non-governing things, and the Federal Reserve is now useless.
Look, I'm very much looking forward to that next week, just for the record, and absolutely love that conversation. I think it's great that we could just have that sort of deeper dive into. I mean, you bought it from someone who is very experienced, 91 years old, which is impressive in itself. 93 years old, yes. Very impressive, that history and bringing it all together. And when you start to look and pick apart some of those parallels, it's so important because we can learn a lot from history there. And I know it's an area you're really interested in it, and you always find an interesting way to sort of dig into it. So thank you for that. Looking forward to next week, but thanks for that today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.